heading east on 14th Street here from Racine. And on the right, you see these new residential buildings. And these cover what used to be densely packed block of crowded wooden frame dwellings and small stables for horses. On the right, buried beneath these foundations, was the lost street Solon Place. This one short block was Chicago in microcosm. On the one corner stood a Jewish temple, and directly across the street from it, the famous saloon of the political boss Dudley Solon. And in June of 1912, the economic pressure from the Chicago-based beef trust became too much for the people, and the women's resistance peaked right here at the shop on 14th Street in Solon Place, at the beef place. They had been attacking other shops, destroying crates of chickens and pouring oil on meat to make it unusable. They also broke windows, attacked police, and attacked shop owners. These women have been attacking and rioting sometime in June of 1912. And it had been happening for about 10 years up until that point. Mostly in New York and I think Detroit as well. I don't know why people ain't protesting the prices of things now. Out there rioting, breaking things up. These women were throwing meat out in the street. The guy on 14th and Solon, that shop, they locked him inside, throwing rocks in the windows and screaming. But 100 years ago and prior, in Chicago, here on this street, used to have a lot of wooden houses, horses, chickens, kids playing in the street, some crime. Over the decades, it was an interesting intersection that just completely disappeared. Then next door to that shop, there was a dance hall, or it was just a hall where there was like a lot of meetings. Prominent people spoke there. It was called the New Starlight Hall, and it was an eventful place, but it's gone now. And then Solon Saloon on the other side of the street, on the corner, was also a very eventful place. Even though Dudley Solon, that owned that saloon, was an Irish guy, he was born in Ireland, there was a really big amount of Jewish people living in the neighborhood, about 45,000 people. And at the time, they called that the Ghetto. The neighborhood, they called it the Ghetto back then. And in this area called the Ghetto, there was a place that the address was 22 Solon Place, which later was called 1422 Solon Place, which was in the heart of the Ghetto. It was a place that they were trying to teach Christianity to Jewish people. Interesting. And a lot of these rioting women were Jewish women. Not all, but a lot of them were, or most of them, I believe. And at that corner of... on the opposite end of the corner of 14th and Solon Place was that market, and they locked up all the customers that were inside, and the owners. They locked them inside in the market, and they were throwing rocks to the windows and yelling at them and stuff like that. It's a pretty crazy time in the year 1912, Chicago. But there could have been some tough moments in the area, like at the saloon. Dudley Solon owned the place, and there was a woman there in the early 1900s. Her name was Mrs. Hooks, and she wanted to vote. She said she had the right to vote, and back in those days, they used to vote in the saloons. A lot of saloons held voting in the late 1800s and early 1900s, and she would vote there at the saloon, and they caught her, and they said, "No, you can't vote here." And then Dudley Solon stood up for her, and he's like, "Hey, man, she could vote. Leave her alone." And they're like, "No, man, you let her. You don't let her vote here, and you get out of here." And he's like, "No." And then so they broke his nose and broke his leg and threw him out of his own bar where they were voting. So yeah, that kind of stuff happened back then. Pretty wild. And I believe that the group of men that threw him out were the German Lutherans of the neighborhood that were voting in the area. They threw him out, broke his nose and broke his leg, all for sticking up for a girl to vote. Crazy times. So I'm going to give a couple stories that happened on the street surrounding Solon, or Solon's Place, which the street was named after Solon because he was such a influential dude, or the place that he had was so influential and persuasive for voting. There used to be a saying back in the day in Chicago, the way Solon goes, so goes the election. So they named a street after him in the late 1800s. And then he moved to Ogden Avenue, which the address was 3243 Ogden Avenue, which the building, I don't believe that building stands anymore either. So you can't go look at it. So I'll tell a few of the stories of what happened over there in the neighborhood that doesn't exist anymore. For the mothers on Solon Place, the day began not with the clang of the factory, but with the quiet anxiety of the neighborhood. Their small, crowded cottages held their whole world, and the community was tight-knit. Women like Mrs. Magner, who lived at 1437 Solon Place, knew the mothers and the children by name. They shared gossip, swapped goods, and relied on one another. The true system of support in the Ninth Ward. Mrs. Magner's window was her post. Every morning she performed a silent, anxious duty as her private law against the coming chaos. And the chaos she watched for wasn't the politicians arguing at the saloon, but the reckless speed of the city's new technology, the automobile. The street was already cluttered with horses and carts, making it impossible to safely play. Tragically, the vigilance was often not enough. Just down the block, a 7-year-old named Jacob Yukowski, who lived nearby, was struck by a car while playing tag right here on Solon Place. The street, their home, their only playground was constantly threatened by the speed and carelessness of the outside world. It was a daily heartbreak that forced the mothers of this block to carry a constant crushing fear. The truth is, Mrs. Magner and the mothers like her were the unseen heroes of the Solon Place. They couldn't fight the beef trust with clubs, and they couldn't bribe the aldermen like the men in the saloon. Their only weapon was a community of vigilance. They couldn't save Jacob, but they could perform the daily difficult work of watching over the others. The street is gone now, but the legacy of Solon Place isn't just in the dramatic riots and corruption. It's in the quiet, simple law of a mother's vigilance. Okay, here's more. There's Patrick Conroy. He was a railroad employee. He had a steady, though hard-won income, a stable job in a growing city of Chicago. His life was built on the fierce loyalty of the local Irish community, which valued hard work and family. And for Patrick, on a Friday paycheck meant he could contribute to his household, pay his share of the crowded rent, and keep his family secure. His money was his protection, but when his own family troubles spilled into the public, that small stability dissolved. Now Patrick had been drinking, consumed by a dispute over family matters and a small inheritance, fueled by alcohol and anger. He ran directly into his opponent, his own uncle, Thomas Conroy, an ex-policeman. The confrontation exploded right in front of Saloon, the very center of local power. It wasn't the politicians fighting for a vote, it was a family fighting over money. Thomas, the ex-policeman, drew a large knife and plunged it into his nephew. Patrick Conroy was left dangerously stabbed in the street. He made his way to the street all bloody, a dark and bloody sacrifice to the twin demons of the ward, drink and money. And despite the violence, the community did not look away. The incident, though deadly, was reported quickly, and neighbors and men from the saloon rushed to aid the railroad worker. In that raw, dangerous environment, the Irish community fierce loyalty, which had fueled the quarrel, also saved Patrick's life. His story remains a stark testament to the truth of Solon Place. While the saloon was the headquarters for the city's power over a beer, it was also where the family's deepest troubles and the community's basic humanity were put on a bloody display. The Conroys moved eventually to this southern part of Chicago, southeast, somewhere around 83rd Street. And I don't think the whole family moved there, like William Conroy, who was another bartender in Andy Craig's bar that was on State Street. The address was 406 State Street. And that's where William Conroy was a bartender, and he was throwing garbage out the back door of his saloon into the alley and making a big pile of garbage. Eventually the police came, a cop came. The cop's name was Policeman Hogan, Officer Hogan. And Hogan told Conroy to pick up the garbage, and Conroy said no. And then they started a little scuffle there, and Conroy ran into the bar and went to go grab a gun to shoot the cop. And Officer Hogan stopped him. And then Conroy was calling for two guys in the bar to come and help him. And so the two guys run to the bar, and they were going to jump over the bar and attack the police officer. And the cop said, Officer Hogan said, no, don't do it. Because he put his hand on his revolver, and he's like, hey, you jump over that bar, you're going to have some trouble. And so he ended up arresting Conroy, and there was a whole big old thing going on. They were going to let him free after a while. And Officer Hogan's like, dude, don't let him free, man. You can't let him go. He's a troublemaker. He's got to clean up his garbage. So yeah, the Fighting Irish. Wild times in Chicago in the early 1900s. You got family members stabbing each other. Other family members are trying to shoot cops because they don't want to clean up their garbage. It's crazy times. But the Conroys weren't the only ones causing trouble in the streets back in the early 1900s or the 1800s in Chicago. Even though Chicago had become safer as people learned to live together better and manage finances better, and the economy got better, safety got better as well. But there was a couple decades where there was a few neighborhoods that the newspapers wrote about to avoid. Solon's neighborhood was maybe not so much one to avoid, but it was called the Ghetto. Right on the corner of 14th and Solon Place, there was a woman somewhere around the 1920s that was standing there, and a couple guys hit her in the back of the head, knocked her down, and robbed her of like $250 or something like that. Another guy got robbed on 15th Street, which is a block over, which is a block south. So there was crime back then. And usually when you hear about Chicago history, you usually hear about the river being diverted and Al Capone. So I'm presenting here some stories that aren't so popular, that also are part of Chicago history. And yes, before Al Capone, there was lots of gangs. There was a couple decades and there was a couple years where newspapers wrote clippings of places that needed to be avoided, of neighborhoods that you should avoid because of the gang violence. So that happened. It's not only today where you want to avoid like Inglewood, South Shore and stuff like that, where it's a little bit dangerous, but back in the day it was dangerous back then too. There was a time when a couple gang members had come to a woman and tried robbing her and then trying to throw her off the side of the bridge downtown into the river. And so, yeah, a lot of crazy stuff been going on for decades. But I believe Chicago became more civilized over the decades and years. And in my lifetime alone, all of the neighborhoods that I've ever lived in Chicago have become very dangerous to the point to where I want to avoid those areas. But let's get back to the history. To some degree, crime happened throughout Chicago in every decade. I don't want to only focus on crime, but that's all they write about in documents and newspapers. There were gangs all over, Bohemian gangs, Irish gangs, boy gangs. That's for another video. There was even a gang of kids being around like 10 years old that started a gang around Lakeshore Drive in the late 1800s, Chicago. They would rob like women and other children, I guess, for a few cents. A few cents was a lot back then. All right, let's move on. So around Solon Street, there was a Jewish community in the area. They were all close-knit. They had their place of worship right across the street from the kosher market. They're living in the area where any of the sects of Christian folk were, and not very rich, but not too terribly poor. But when the price of kosher meat went up, the women couldn't fit that inflation into their budget, and they started to riot. They set fire to 3 crates of chickens in front of Max Bloomberg's shop on 709 Maxwell Street. They terrorized the owner on 14th and Solon Street and many others. They severely beat the owner and 2 customers at the shop on 14th Street called Shapiro and Jelpfeld. That was the name of the store on the corner of 14th and Solon. The police finally came and saved the people from getting more hurt from the rioters. And the price of beef just went up, 50% or so. A few cents. And a few cents was a lot of money back in the early 1900s. And so women started protesting early. Some women would stand out in front of markets and yell at any women who made a high-priced purchase. The protesters would yell at the women and tell her to throw your meat away. God damn it, don't buy from there. We're protesting. If we gotta suffer, you should suffer too. Other protesters were suggesting to become vegan in protest to the high meat prices. And some kosher shops refused to open their doors until the wholesale prices went back down. And some shops knew that they couldn't raise their prices that much, so they refused to sell beef at the previous price before the wholesale price jump. So some shops closed their doors. Similar riots had happened in Detroit and New York, and there's a book called The Great Kosher Meat War of 1902, Immigrant Housewives and the Riots That Shook New York City, which explains the cultural norms that they may have shared from one region of the earth to another. Yiddish-speaking proud Jewish people from the area. They were a class that newer Jewish immigrants would assimilate to. Many of the newcomers did not come with a lot of money. And when they found work, they may have found jobs that paid only $10 or $20 a week at start. And if you're just starting out, $10 or $20 a week isn't a lot. And rent could be found for anywhere between $10 to $30 a month on average. Tomatoes were 9 cents each, a pound of macaroni for 10 cents, a pound of rice for 8 cents, ham at 11.5 cents a pound, bacon 16 cents a pound, the pound of round steak for 12 to 18 cents, milk was 2 to 3 cents for a quart and a half, a pound of chicken was 25 cents, prime rib was 10 cents, a pound of corned beef boneless brisket at 9 cents, 10 pounds of sugar for 56 cents, sirloin steak at 15 cents a pound. And so eating a pound of beef a day could cost $4.50 a month. And I guess if you can add a zero to all what you make and then how much you pay, I guess you get a kind of better perspective of what they were looking at. If you add a zero to the end of all those numbers, like times 10 of all those numbers. And at the top of the pay, you would get something like $200 a week and pay $300 a month and pay $45 for a pound of steak. And add another zero, you'll get $2,000 a week, $3,000 a month for rent, and $450 for a pound of steak a month. Just to put that in perspective of what they may had been perceiving in their funds in the year 1905 in Chicago. A man who lived alone would have an easy time, but a guy with a family of 5 or more would have more of a rough time trying to get by. And they would need to have their own garden or apple tree and chicken coop. And if they had their own business or got top pay for being at a company for a while, they would have an easier time to get by. And then children also would grow up to get jobs and help pay for things or fend for themselves. So it'd make it easier on the family, the more kids you have. Or the more kids that move out, right? But when the price of food went up, and especially the kosher meat went up a few cents, so did the percentage. And there's a woman named Mrs. Clara Friedman that lived at 1010 South Paulina Street. And then there was also a Mrs. Anna Gross, that these two women led a movement of women against butchers and the rising cost of meat. And the women may have even forbade the others to even buy chicken. They told the other women to become vegetarian until the prices went back to normal. They would have meetings at Halsted and Maxwell Street at the time. And when the women went out to riot, they even threw kerosene on the chickens to make them unusable. And a lot of chickens were killed in these riots because of it. They were just throwing kerosene on these chickens. And Mrs. Friedman would threaten the butchers and tell them not to open shop until the prices went back down. But it was a peaceful protest that destroyed things and killed chickens. Obama would have been proud. And the market on 14 Solon Street felt the effects of these riots, and that's why I'm bringing these riots up. But, I was interested in other things too, like who lived on Solon Street. And what was the neighborhood like? And I didn't see a lot of Mexican or black folks in the area. But of course, the newspaper would only alert about the crime and not the others, right? And so there was someone named Mrs. Dolores Sherwood who hired a black man named Eugene McFarland to do general work at her house. And Dolores lived at 1449 Solon Place. Eugene lived at 1357 Blue Island Avenue. And Eugene was a handy dude that can seemingly take on any task to get a job done. So he did odd jobs around various people's houses. And Dolores was a widow, and so she needed a man to come and do random things at her house for her. And so she had Eugene carry coal for her one day. And in the meantime, Dolores made her way to the table to light a cigarette, and she sat for a bit and wondered why she didn't hear Eugene's footsteps carrying in the coal anymore. And so she went to investigate if he was doing all right, whether he was doing all right or not. And she didn't see him in his typical path to bring in the coal, so she started walking around her place searching for him. Then she found him in her bedroom going through her drawers. And she asked in a loud voice what he was doing in the room. And they started to argue, and then Eugene walked out angry while he was yelling. They were yelling back and forth. Then he came back into the room with an iron, some kind of iron that he grabbed from another room, and he struck Dolores in her head. And then hours later, Dolores was found laying on her floor in a puddle of blood. Neighbors heard her moaning behind the wooden frame structure of her house, and Dolores was found bloody on the floor with a fractured skull. And earlier that day, though, another white woman named Morris Greenberg was killed at the address of 3448 West 15th Street. The neighbors said it was a black man hired to wash windows who did it. The police caught up and arrested McFarland. And after Dolores had gained some consciousness and found her bearings and identified McFarland as the man who struck her with the iron, the neighbors from the other resident said that McFarland was not the killer of the first attack on 15th Street. And McFarland was brought to court and was found insane. They later sent him to some kind of insane asylum or hospital. But I guess it wasn't very segregated back then if they all lived near each other. Eugene said that he wasn't sorry that he wasn't sorry that he hurt the girl. He said he was sorry that he didn't kill her. Eugene said he wished that she had died so that she wouldn't be able to identify him. And that's some crazy times. And the police then posted a public note to women to not let strangers in their house because it could end up being very dangerous. But I don't know. Oddly enough, I found, I look on all the census and I go through them, spend a couple hours searching. And I found one supposed black man in the neighborhood. And on the census, it says that he was a white guy, a white Russian named William McFarland, whose parents are also Russian, who lived on Blue Island Street. William McFarland. And perhaps this William McFarland had a black child that named Eugene. Eugene isn't in the census. But the old address system located McFarland at 382 Blue Island. And then later Eugene at 1357, so I don't know. A lot of Irish and German people lived in that area on the street at the time. Some were first generation, some not. McFarland lived alone in the year 1900, so maybe he had a kid in the next decade or not. I don't know. But perhaps the black McFarland lied about his Irish name and said that he and his family were from Russia. But there's no other McFarland in the census that says that he lived on Blue Island Street or in the area at the time. And there was a 13-year-old Eugene McFarland that lived on 31st and South Street, SOWE. And he lived there at the time of the murder, but he was only 13 years old. So I don't think it was that same guy. And this was a 13-year-old white kid with parents that were from Iowa and Michigan, not from Russia, as the McFarland on Blue Island said, and not the black dude from who stuck Dolores in the head. It was a 13-year-old white kid. So I don't know who the McFarland is, and I don't know why they wrote that in a newspaper. And maybe the black dude lied about his name and used the kid's name. I don't know. From the year 1900, there were a majority of Jewish and Russian people living on Maxwell Street in the neighborhood. I looked into the census, looking at all the different people and trying to find any black people or Mexican or any other race or ethnicity. And I found that on 18th Street and 17th Street held a big amount of Bohemian people on it, at least on the western edge. Then a big group of Polish people for the next couple blocks. Then the blocks after that, mostly Bohemians. Again, it was like tons of Bohemians on 17th Street and 18th Street in Chicago back in the day. And 16th Street was also door after door Bohemian. And a couple of Polish and Irish, maybe a few Austrian families, but mostly Bohemian. And 18th Halsted had a couple blocks each direction of exclusive German people as well. So they all flocked together in like little areas or streets, like different ethnicities. There must have been lots of different types of food, right? Morgan Street was made up of a mix of people from Holland, Germany, Ireland, and Austria. 15th Street, starting from the western part of the neighborhood, was a lot of Irish, Scottish, and English families. Then a few blocks almost exclusively Irish families, until you get to the edge of the neighborhood towards State Street. Then there was some Russian and some German families that started to appear on the street. But there was no Latin American or black presence yet in the area. So Solon Place had people that were Norwegian and Ancestry. And then there was some Italians there, and Irish, English, German, and Scottish. And about half of the people in the neighborhood seemed to be almost being first generation. And then the other half were second generation or more. And the ones who were second generation or more were sometimes born in other states, like either Wisconsin or Ohio or New York. They had various jobs: wood finishers, laborers, watchmen. There was some Swedish bartenders on Johnson Street. There was a small Chinese family who lived and did laundry on 14th Street. So that was the first non-white family I found in the whole neighborhood. And I looked at the whole census. Isn't that crazy? And on Solon Street was a boarding house. So there might have been people in here that weren't part of the census because they come and go, right? And there was a lot of different boarding houses around Chicago at the time. And these people used to let them come and live in the place and rent out these rooms. And a lot of the boarders called their landlords cheats or scams at the time, So everybody was, coming and going from these places. Nobody likes a boarding house or paying rent. But these boarding houses were owned usually or ran by a good amount of women, especially widows, who turned to the business of renting out to boarders. And some women would charge as much as, or as little as $5 a week, or $3.50 a day to rent a room. Boarding houses were around for decades in Chicago, and some women who held boarding houses learned from their mothers who held the same business. And some of the typical things in these boarding houses were that you could find were like books, pianos, and food, right, and heat, and the smell of unwashed laborers who spent most of their free time with drink. There were typically clean facilities, though, There was a Swedish maid that lived on 14th and Halsted at the time. Some maids were employed as servants at these boarding houses, and they made the home cooked meals there for everyone. And if anyone acted out of hand, the landlords would give the boarders their money back and kick them out of the boarding house. But yeah, there was a lot of maids there. Every boarding house had one or two, or depending on how well the facility was ran, they had all the help they could, right? And there was all these different walks of life that stayed at these boarding houses. And one woman said that she had attended some 20 medical and dental students at a boarding house. So it wasn't just like laborers and clerks and stuff like that. There was some people that were, trying to be something. She had ministers at her boarding house. She had doctors, congressmen, clerks, solicitors, and a bunch of other people renting a space either for a day or a week or more. And landlords hoped for a yearly stay sometimes, but sometimes undesirable people would stay for 10 or 15 years. And then these undesirable people would be the ones who would start fights or complain all the time, which they called kicking. They were called kicking back then. They were kicking about the food. But anyways, contentious people can be annoying and unwanted, leaving you stuck with them because nobody else wants them, or even their own family. And other annoying occupants would do other things like light their matches on walls with fresh paint on them, and they would leave scratches. They would clean their black shoes with white towels. And in the early 1900s, they would have ink to write with, right? So sometimes they would spill that ink on bed sheets or on a dresser, and the landlord would be pissed, like, God damn, another one. And others would leave like the gas light on all night, complaining that they paid for the room so they could do whatever they want with the gas being left on. So, yeah, those were a lot of the kind of complaints back then. And sometimes people would stay at the boarding house while they were unemployed or starting a business. And they say that when they get back on their feet, they will pay later. And sometimes they would be trusted. In one instance, a man stayed in a boarding house with his wife and 2 daughters for a while, and they were put in the best room in the house. And every week, he would give some kind of excuse that he doesn't have the money. And his bill ran to cost up to $600 before the landlady got sick of him. And she's like, dude, what's the deal? This guy's name was Mr. Pody. And he started running for Congress while he was living at the boarding house. And he would have his son steal flour from the kitchen to make a paste out of it to hang up their political posters in the streets. And the landlord gave him a deadline, but he couldn't leave. He couldn't leave the district. He didn't want to pay, but he couldn't leave because he couldn't leave the district because it would screw with his election in the district. So eventually, he came up with $100 and a $450 piano. He gave it to the landlady for payment. She's like, fine. And I guess he eventually got elected too. He became a Chicago politician. Anyways, some landlords were cheaper than others, but the usual rate was approximately 22 cents a day with an additional 50 cents a meal, a home-cooked meal, which would be about 72 cents a day, equaling about $5.04 a week. Now, if someone made $20 a week, they would spend their whole paycheck on living expenses at the boarding house. But those were usually jobs. People who were making $20 a week were usually just starting out, But if people who had worked somewhere for a while, become a little established, and be making a little bit more money at the time, in the year 1905. And in Chicago in the year 1905, only about 5/8 of the total boarding houses allowed women to stay there at the boarding house. Some boarding houses had an ethnic majority, and other boarding houses were made of artists, musicians, and the sorts, and other boarding houses would not allow any women. And some of the women owners or managers or whatever would complain that they didn't want women renting rooms because they could been seen as like some sort of nuisance, always asking or complaining about something or gossiping. One man wrote that boarding houses held rich and poor people, and the rich were just there for some time until they made enough money or made a decision to go somewhere else. But then there was a lower class people who only made like $12 to $15 a week, he said. And most boarding houses were at least $5 a week. And a lot of these lower class people would stay there. People that only made $12 to $15 a week. He said that most of all the boarding houses up until the year 1905 in Chicago were generally the same. But there was a third class, he called it, which were the type of houses that allowed women to stay there also. And there was a moral code, there was rules, and an expected politeness in all the houses. But the third class had its own distinctness about it. They all had a front parlor with seats around the room with a piano and ornaments giving the room some type of color. The boarders would usually come and sit in the front parlor during the evening. But then there was other boarders that rather be left alone and don't join the others in the parlor. But in the parlors, you could usually meet women who don't make a lot of money and are looking for a husband, or just for a conversation too, right? And then he said that there was men in the parlors, and usually the men at the boarding houses are usually not too well to do in the parlor. They're usually the kind of guys that you don't really want to end up with, he said, for the women. And so the women are like, well, I guess if you're the only one here. But he said, yeah, they are usually undesirable men who don't make a lot of money and don't have a lot to talk about with anyone for the lack of learning anything. And for example, he said the boarders at the dinner table would talk about the hypes of the day, which were hangings, rats, because there was still hangings back then, right? In various places. Then they would talk about murders, politics, new novels, theaters, and whatever else they read about in the newspaper. He said that most of the things that they talked about was in the newspaper because they didn't know anything else. He says that everything that they talked about at the table was what they read about in the newspaper. And he said that most men didn't speak good grammatical English. They would spit bad English at each other and sometimes fight. And some civilized people from the outside described the entire situation as being depressing. Even some of the well-to-do lawyers spoke bad English at the boarding house. And then he said there was a 25-year-old young woman from Chicago who stayed at a boarding house there in the city. And she said that if you stay too long in a boarding house, you'll get demoralized, she said. And she would sometimes this woman would sometimes allow male boarders to come into her room at night so she can make some money with them. And the boarding house rules didn't say anything wrong with women trying to make money from men in a boarding house at night. So I guess it happened quite frequently. At 1423 Solon Place was a boarding house ran by a woman named Mrs. Louise Schubert. And then there was a boarder named Leopold Whistler who came home one night to see Louise sitting by the fireplace, and Leopold demanded dinner from Louise, but she didn't have any food left at that hour, and Leopold started to argue with her and demand the food, but she denied him that night. And so he got pissed off, and then he grabbed a pipe and threatened her with it. Mrs. Schubert came to her husband, and the husband came into the room and rescued her from Leopold. Well, sort of. They got into a fight, and they started, wrestling around, and Leo stuck. He struck the husband 3 times in the head and knocked him out, bloody, just because he didn't get dinner. And the police and ambulance came and took Mr. Schubert to the hospital, and they took Leopold to jail. So that's some things that happen in a boarding house. And one observer said that if the whole city was to be like that of a boarding house, then there would be a high time for somebody to start a social revolution that will sweep it away. It was that bad, I guess. But the boarding house is not the only crazy place, or only place where crazy things happened. Just down the street, there was a Russian family that lived at 1427 Solon Street in the early 1900s. A man and his wife and his daughter were living there for a couple of years since they came from Russia. And back in the old country, one of the uncles had a crush on their daughter. He was trying to sleep with her and marry her and all that stuff. And the parents, their daughter's name was Sarah Bell, and they didn't want her. The parents nor the daughter wanted to be with the uncle, or Sarah Bell didn't want to be with the uncle, and the parents didn't want it to happen either, and so they told the dude to stay away. So they moved to Chicago, and so the uncle followed them. But the family told him not to come around, and so he didn't. And then the uncle went off, and the uncle's name was Herman Bell. He ended up marrying a country woman who he had one child with, and they moved to the address at 433 West Taylor Street sometime around the year 1903. And Herman came to his family on Solon Street and told them that he wasn't a threat anymore because he had a wife now and a child. So he started coming around more often after they started to trust him. The family started to trust him more. And the story goes that they were supposed that Herman and Sarah, his niece, were supposed to meet one night on a Wednesday night. Herman said that Sarah wanted to spend time with him. That's what he said. And that she already told him that she wanted him to get a divorce from his wife and new child so they could be together. So he says, right? It could be true. But when Herman showed up to her house, she was sitting on the front steps with a few good-looking young men. Herman was 30 years old, and Sarah was 20 years old. So she was able to get younger guys to come and hang out with her. And Herman didn't like that. He was real jealous. So he pulled out his gun and he shot her 3 times. He shot her twice in the hand and once in the heart. And she was screaming for him to stop. All the family and all the neighbors came outside to see what was happening, and seeing the crazy uncle standing there with the gun while the niece was dying on the stairs. The police came and arrested Herman. And in the meantime, all the neighbors and all the people in the streets were yelling to lynch him, to lynch Herman. They're like, burn him, hang him. Everybody's like, man, I read about it, let's hang him. Crazy times. Crazy times in old Chicago. Did you know that people didn't even have bathtubs then? A lot of people, especially a lot of poor neighborhoods. A lot of lower income people didn't have bathtubs in their house, and baths weren't really common in Chicago in houses until maybe the 1940s or 50s. Especially lower class houses, or these kind of apartments or rooms, right? But before that, before having baths in the house, there were bathhouses or spots to bathe all over the city. Some people would even wash themselves in the lake. Talk about some crazy times. But yeah, there's still a building that still stands that used to be an old bathhouse that's still in Pilsen. It's not a bathhouse anymore. They're trying to turn it into an apartment building to pack people in like sardines and charge them like $2,000 a month for rent. But you know how it is. That's how it goes. Okay, what is something else that happened here on Solon Street that's covered up and it's missing, lost in history now. In the year 1901, 14 horses were burned alive in a fire. There were a lot of horses and chickens that could have been seen or heard on the street in early Chicago. And in early Chicago, you mean seeing people advertising the sale of horses instead of a car like you do these days in the newspapers. Horses and wagons were for sale back then. And at the address of 418 West 14th Street, there was a two-story structure where horse stables were on the first floor, and the basement held supplies for the stables. And a guy named Harry Gordon owned those horses in that stable. And on the second floor of that building, there was a family of Finkelstein who owned the building. And imagine living upstairs from the horses, huh? Yeah, these people lived upstairs from horses. They probably didn't have plumbing. They probably showered in the bathhouses down the street. They probably had some kind of outhouse to piss in behind the horse stables. But yeah, they lived upstairs from horses. I guess it would be better than living downstairs from the horses, right? There was a basement there. And that Harry Gordon guy lived kitty corner on the block at 1405 Solon Place. He owned the horses on the one side of the street, and he lived on the other side. And the fire somehow started in the basement of the horse stables. And the wooden buildings lit up with flames really quickly, and the Finkelstein family smelled the fire and immediately ran out of the house. The fire grew so large that it spread to a barn behind Harry Gordon's house, and the firemen came to put out the fire, and the losses amounted to $2,500. That's how much it cost to fix everything. None of the family was hurt, and only the horses had died from the fire. Yeah, Chicago used to have barns and horse stables. You see all these horses in the old Chicago pictures. Now you know where some of those horses had lived. And Finkelstein was a tailor, and he had a tailor shop at his house that was above the horse stables. And the loss of the horses in the tailor shop and the wooden structure only amounted to $2,500. That's crazy. Average rent prices were anywhere from $10 to $20 at the time. Some places a person could get a room and board for as much as $4 or $5 a week, which included a telephone, bathroom, and toilets sometimes. There was an apartment for rent at the time on 2001 Michigan Avenue for $250 a week. It's even cheaper. That building for $250 a week on Michigan Avenue was even furnished. And then on the address 651 Monroe Street, rented a room for $1.50 a week. And 467 Fulton Street, rented a room for as low as $2 or more for bigger rooms. Man, it was crazy times. It was cheap stuff, wasn't it? You could buy some ribs for 13 cents back then. Can you imagine buying ribs for that cheap now? But, some people didn't make a lot of money, especially women. Some saleswomen made like $7 to $10 a week. An assistant bookkeeper, when he just started out, could make up $10, as little as $10 a week. Where an office girl would make like $5 a week. Crazy, crazy times. But yeah, that's Solon Street. That's Solon Street, Solon. And it doesn't exist anymore. It's got buildings on top of where it used to be. Nobody knows what used to be there. The horses died. They burned alive there. And then an uncle shot up his niece on that street. And now they have apartment buildings, I think, for college students, if I'm not mistaken. There was a really cool saloon on the corner. Then across the street from that was a Jewish kosher market. There's a lot of cool stuff on the street. Now the street's completely gone. All the shops, everything that was there is completely gone. Not one thing from that time period is there anymore. So, making some history that's not common, that's not commonly talked about. I'm making a history episode here about uncommon things, I guess. Making a history episode about things not commonly talked about in history. They're not popular, right? You don't hear about them in school. But why would you? Not unless you're like a freak to learn about all this stuff in history. But kids need only to learn about the general things in history, right? Or unless you're trying to persuade the kids to think a certain way, then you got to put in your persuasion in there. But these kind of history things that we're talking about here in this episode are not kind of persuasion things. They're just people that are interested in history plainly. Yeah, Chicago history.